Hi everyone, and welcome to another wood embroidery project. Before getting started on the actual tutorial, I just want to mention the differences between stitching the wood embroidery kit and the digital pattern for paper. Now, the only difference between the two is the eyes. It's the same technique, it's just different holes are used to create the technique here. And the second difference are the lines here, these stitches. In the wood, they're engraved, and for the paper embroidery, they're actually stitched on. And these are just simple back stitches using the ultrafine awl. Apart from that, though, they are the same. The tutorial could be used to stitch either one or the other. So the technique for the eye will be at the very end of the video, right after the tutorial on how to make the pom-poms. And also I want to mention, in the wood embroidery kit instruction guide, I actually illustrated the stitching for the chain stitch backwards or reversed. So in the digital pattern that you received for free, it's been corrected. So all it is, you know, these are the first two stitches are straight stitches, and you just kind of follow along. So just follow the video tutorial and not so much the printed guide. I think those are the things I need to mention before we get started. And if you find the tutorial helpful, please like and subscribe. That's always really helpful. And I hope you enjoy stitching up this sugar skull kit. For this project, we're going to need two types of needles. We're going to need our number 24 tapestry needle and a flexible beading needle. Now we're going to try to avoid using the beading needle as much as possible, but it is necessary to do when we are going to embroider the two flowers at the very top and this one here above the eye. These two flowers require a type of weaving technique, and it's going to be a little bit tight, so the flexibility of this needle is going to come in very handy. Alright, so to get started, we're going to take our regular beading needle, 6 strands of thread, and the first elements that we're going to stitch are the greenery here and here. Now we need to stitch those two elements first because we're going to be using those stitches from the back as anchoring stitches for the two elements here. So to get started, I'm going to start with this leaf here. I'm going to start at the very top, and we're going to work these two elements, all the greenery and stem stitch. Now follow your chart as far as the direction of your stitch. To get started, I went up hole 1. I'm going down hole number 3. I'm coming back up hole number 4. To go back down hole number 2. So what we're doing essentially is connecting even holes with even and odd holes with odd. So here we are at hole number, let me just count, 1, 2, 3, 4, hole number 4. And I will be going back down hole number 2. Check out your guide to know what direction of the stitch to go in. For this one, I'm going below the stitch here to achieve the smoothest curve. Once you've completed one side of the leaf, go ahead and come back up to the point to start again. Same thing for this leaf here. Once you complete one side of it, come back up to the very top to complete the rest. And do try to avoid going through the knots whenever you can. When you come to an end of a section or a thread, the best way to secure your end thread is to anchor it to some of the surrounding stitches. So all you have to do is go below a few of the stitches and kind of go through the loop and make a knot. And then you could go ahead and just snip it off and go ahead and continue. So to move on, we're going to be working on the rose here. That is called a woven wheel rose. The first steps that we need to do to accomplish this piece is stitch these little spokes, 5 little spokes that go around. After that, we're going to come up through that large hole there between those two, and we're going to weave the thread in and out. For this part, we will be using our beading needle. Now I've cut it extra long because I'm going to go ahead and first stitch the spokes using 6 strands, and then I'm just going to go ahead and snip that and fold the thread over to use 12. Now these need to be on the looser end. Do not add a lot of tension. Sometimes what I like to do, I like to go ahead and put my needle, my regular needle, just to make sure that I give it enough slack. So after you've done stitching your 5 spokes and they're all on the looser end, go ahead and secure your thread by going through one of the surrounding stitches. Now for the same thread and needle, I'm just gonna go ahead and fold it over using 12 strands now. Gonna make a chunky knot, pull my needle to the center. Favorite part about these beading needles is that they have a little pinched tip. All you have to do is kind of push it to the end and it kind of locks it in place. So we're gonna come up through that hole here in the center, off to the side I mean. We're gonna go ahead and just start weaving in and out from each of the spokes. So for this one, if I go over, I'm gonna go below this one. So now I'm going to go over that one and below this one. And the flexibility of the needles coming in handy already. We're going to be going, we went below that one, so now we're going to go above that one and below this one. And we're just going to be going in that pattern all the way around. You don't need a lot of tension for this stitch as well. Keep it on the looser end. That's going to give you a flower that's a little bit more relaxed, a little fuller, not so smashed. And we're going to continue in this pattern until you get pretty much to the end of the outer circle spokes. Here, when it gets tighter, with my nail, I'm just lifting the needle up to avoid grabbing any of those green stitches. Now I'm just gonna, as it's getting tighter, I kind of need to push the rosebud to the side to be able to get through. Now, when you want to stop, that's up to you. So, I'm pretty happy there. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to go and do a few stitches going back down through any of the outer holes that you stitched the spokes through. So, as you can see there. So now I'm going to come back up another hole. Make sure not to grab any of that thread. And this is just kind of like covering up some of those larger holes. The only part missing for this flower is the center, which will be a French knot. We'll come back to that towards the end. Now I'm going to go ahead and secure my thread by anchoring to the back to some of the stitches. Don't add a lot of tension here. We just want to secure the thread. It doesn't need to be super tight, because we don't want to add more tension to the flower. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to stitching this little flower. For this, we're going to first stitch the spokes that are for each petal, and then we're going to go ahead and kind of weave detached chain stitches to create the flower effect. If you plan to use the gold thread for the spokes, make sure that you use your beading needle for that. If you plan to use a cotton thread of any other color of your preference, you could go ahead and use the regular needle. You don't need to use the beading. But I find that working with the gold thread using the beading needle is just a little bit more friendly. So I'm doing the same technique as I did for the rose there. These spokes are loose, not a lot of tension. When I come to the end, I'm going to go ahead and secure this thread. Okay, now that we have our gold little spokes completed, we're going to start with embroidering the first petal here in the center. We're going to come up that hole. We're going to go below this stitch and back down that hole. And here you could also use your beading needle, or as you could see, I'm using the regular one. I think you could really get away with either one here. These two petals on the side of the center one will be this main color, this magenta, and then the outer ones will be green. Now to stitch the two petals to the side, we're going to come in through this larger hole. We're going to go through the bottom of this stitch here. We're going to go back down that larger hole. And now we can't come back up again through that hole, otherwise we're going to completely undo the stitch. So I'm just going to go ahead and go below one of these surrounding stitches to kind of lock it in. And now I could go back down that center hole, and I know that that stitch won't fall apart. So I think that for the last two petals on the side, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my beading needle. I think trying to get through this section here and there with the other needle is going to be a little bit tricky. I think having this flexibility is going to be really helpful. I'm going to go ahead and go below some of these stitches before going back down that center hole. You have to be very careful when you're using a beading needle. They're not really meant for embroidery, so sometimes the tips like to snag the thread, so just be very careful. Take it slow. Okay, to move on, we're going to go ahead and work on the flower that makes up the eye. The process is the same as for this flower. We need to stitch the spokes first. We're going to be using our beading needle with the gold thread for that. And then we're going to be going and looping through with our other thread to create the petals. And once you've completed stitching them, again, just make sure that you secure your thread to some of the stitches surrounding. Now to get started, we're going to be using these stitches as our anchoring stitches, except for the first one. The first one I'm going to go ahead and use one of the surrounding stitches. I'm going to go through the large hole there, and I'm just going to go below the gold spoke, back down the large hole. And now what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to go again, I'm using the gold stitches to anchor my thread. So now I'm just going to go here and then back down. And I get to go below. Again, and go below the next gold spoke, the next gold stitch. So here we have our flower. Now the only thing that we need to do is stitch the center with the French knot. But before I do that, I'm taking the back of a needle and just kind of like pushing the threads to the side to kind of create a neater entrance for our French knot. Because I want to avoid having any knots there, I'm actually going to secure my thread. I'm going to anchor my thread in one of these stitches. I'm going to continue to kind of open the center because I don't want to snag any of the other threads, and I'm going to go ahead and find my center. Alright, going to go ahead and pull through. I'm going to go around my needle twice, 1, 2, and I'm going to go back down that center hole, maintaining tension on my thread, light tension, and just kind of holding it down and creating the French knot there. Now for all the rest of the French knots, it's always going to be 2 turns. Just want to go ahead and mention that just in case I forget later on. After I've done my first one, what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to go ahead and go towards a little bit towards the side and make a few more knots. I think I want this to look a little bit fuller in the center. Okay, there we go. I like that. I think it looks a little odd because the other one is not completed, but I think I like it. The next element that we're going to be working on is the nose. Now my piece, again, like I mentioned, is a sample piece and it has an engraved area. I decided not to include that in the final piece because it made it actually pretty difficult to stitch around it. The needle was constantly getting stuck in that ridge. The outside shape of the nose is chain stitched, and we're only going to need 6 strands for that. Now I'm using my beading needle for this because, again, of that engraving area, the needle was getting stuck, but I think that you could get away with using your regular needle for the outside shape. For a chain stitch, we're going to do 2 anchoring stitches, 2 straight stitches on the side at the very top. We created our first straight stitch. We came up hole number, if that's hole 1, 2, 3, we're coming up hole 3. We're going to go ahead and go below our little straight stitch and back down hole number 3 to create our first chain stitch. Beading needle snagged one of the threads, so I'm going to go ahead and just fix that. Pulling it out a little bit, twisting my thread a little bit, and then tugging down. So once you're done with one side of the nose, we're going to go back up. Come back up to hole number 3 on the opposite side, and we're going to continue in that same pattern. Alright, so we are done with the outer shape of the nose. Now, so for the center of the nose, we're going to be doing detached chain stitches. We're going to be using 6 strands for that. We're going to come up that top center hole. We're going to go back down that same center hole, but we're going to leave a loop behind, as you can see. Now we're going to go ahead and go through the hole that is to the left to start off, and we're going to just pull gently until we get the shape that we like. Go back down that hole, pull down gently. We have our first shape, and we're going to go ahead and go back up that hole again. Do the same. We're going to go back down, leave a loop behind, go through the loop and tack it down. Don't pull too hard so we don't distort the shape too much. And there we go. We've completed the center of the nose. At this stage, you can move on to stitch any part of the piece that you like, but I'm going to go ahead and stitch the outer shapes just so you can see how I start off the chain stitches. 2 straight stitches at the very top. Now you could actually just do one and start there, but I like to just go ahead and do both to kind of add tension to those stitches there. All right, and then I could go ahead and continue my chain stitch from there. And as you can see for this, I'm just using my regular needle. I don't think you need to use your beading needle for this part. Now for this section, do skip that green one and just go next to it. Now to work on this part of the cheekbone, we actually need to start here at the first hole to the tooth. When you get to this last chain stitch, go ahead and anchor your stitch there and back down. So that's what it should look like at the end. To work on the chin, we're going to start our first straight stitches at the center. So when you get to the last stitch for the chin, try to go through that top stitch through the center. And there you go. All right, I'm gonna move on to the teeth. Now the teeth is made up of a couching stitch. We're gonna be using our beading needle for the gold, and we're gonna be using our regular needle with 1 strand of thread folded over to stitch with 2. Now I'm gonna go ahead and come up through this hole here. And the first stitch here is just a straight stitch. I'm gonna come up, back up this hole, and down this hole. And we are going to leave it a little bit of slack. I'm gonna take our next needle. We're gonna anchor it because this is so thin, this is just gonna go through. So I'm gonna go ahead and secure it. I'm gonna go ahead and anchor it in one of these stitches here. And I'm going to go up that first hole of the tooth. And I'm just gonna be tacking that gold thread down. And as you're tacking down, you could pull gently on the gold to just kind of help you line up the shape. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and through the back, just hold this thread down with some tension with the back of my finger. I'm gonna go up that hole there, and it's gonna essentially, I'm gonna wrap it around to this hole here. So the arcs that we're making start from the start from this line here and curve around through the center of the next arc. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I hope it does. So here we go. This is the arc that I'm forming. It's not from all the way from point A all the way down. It's just midway. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and just let that drop, and I'm gonna go ahead and start here with my white thread and start tacking down the gold. And I will be going through that first hole that I went, that gold, and just tack it. Can you see the shape of the arc? It goes from here to halfway as opposed from there all the way down. To complete the teeth, all you need to do is straight stitch that center line using one strand of gold thread and doubling it up. And for this, I do highly recommend using your regular needle. And there you go. You're done with the teeth. Now we use the same couching technique for the flower shape on top and also for the bottom. The next element we're going to stitch are the two little flowers in the cheekbone, and this is going to be done using 6 strands folded over to equal 12, and we're just going to make straight stitches from the outer holes into the center, leaving them fairly loose in order to create the illusion of volume. Okay, so now the only element left to complete these little flowers is doing the center French knot. For the bottom greenery here, go ahead and start doing the stem first using stem stitch, and then we're going to do the little petals using the detached chain stitch. I think we've covered all of the elements to complete your calavera. This little detail here is made up of only 6 strands. So is the heart. The little flower shape here is also, the flower here is just like the top. It's 12 strands with 2 strands of the gold. And all the French knots around the eye and the flowers are going to be 6 strands doubled up to 12, and each knot is 2 turns. I almost forgot to mention that the inner veins for the leaves are made up of 2 strands using backstitch. So for all that is you go up one and down the other and come back up the next one and down the previous. It's a very simple stitch. So making the pom-poms is so much fun, and it's really easy and very addicting. All you need is your fork, your yarn, some scissors, and a needle. Now do try to find a fork that is wide. This one is a little bit over an inch. and I'm going to be combining my two colors together. All I have to do is put my yarn over my fork and start turning it. I think that 15 turns using the double strands of yarn achieve like the nicest size pom-poms for this project. If you're only using one color, one strand of yarn, double that up to 30 turns. So once you wrap your thread about 15 times, I push it a little bit above to have this section exposed. I trim my yarn. I take my beading needle with the scrap of yarn. I feed the yarn through the center and up through that center prong. I could go ahead and take off my needle, and I'm just going to make sure I tighten this nice and tight, keeping all the thread together. So this is going to be a really tight knot. Now I have found that 15 turns, once I have that first knot, I could go ahead and slide the fork off, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap this a few more times. I feel comfortable doing it maybe 2 more times, and also tighten it again as tight as you can. Alright, so now that you have your little bundle together, you could go ahead and trim off any of the excess thread, and we're going to separate all the loops that we created. So once you've split all your loops, go ahead and give your pom-pom a haircut by just trimming all around to shape the little ball. Okay, so now that I'm happy with my shape, I'm going to take my regular needle and I'm going to make a really chunky knot. Alright, and then I'm just going to go ahead and pierce through the center of the pom-pom until the thread catches. And then I'm just going to trim that little end of thread. And there you go. This is how you string your pom-poms. And if you purchased one of the kits from me, I actually provided enough yarn to possibly make up to 5 to 7 pom-poms. So you could really string these along in a really nice length and have a lot of fun placing them on your sugar skull. So to work on the flower that makes up the eye for paper embroidery, the technique is the same as stitching it in wood. We first need to stitch the spokes, and then we're going to go up one hole through the bottom of the spoke and then back down. The only difference is that for the wood we have a large hole and we need to anchor the stitch to the back of each spoke. For this situation we don't need to do that. For this, each petal hole corresponds to its own spoke, so all we have to do is come up through the hole, you go through the spoke, and then you go back down that same hole that you came up, creating that petal shape. And you also have 5 holes in the center to make up the center of the flower with French knots. So that's really the only difference that you have to keep in mind when stitching the paper embroidery pattern and the wood embroidery.